Hello, this is Dana, and I'm glad to be bringing the 12th segment of the Master the Bible Today series, a snapshot of the book of Numbers. My goal is to help people to understand the Bible and for us to apply these proven truths to help improve our lives. The purpose of Numbers, written by Moses, is to tell the story of how Israel prepared to enter the promised land, how they sinned and were punished, and how they prepared to try again. As Numbers begins, the nation of Israel was still camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. The people had received God's laws and were preparing to move. After determining the number of men fit for military service, the people were set apart for God. God was making the people both spiritually and physically ready to receive their inheritance. As the children of Israel journeyed from the foot of Mount Sinai to the land of Canaan, the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the land of the covenant, they grumbled, whined, complained, and rebelled against God at every turn. They focused on their present discomforts. First, the people complained about the food. Next, it was over Moses' authority. Rebellion against God is always a serious matter. Make sure your negative comments are not the product of a rebellious spirit. God punished the Israelite people, but spared the nation because of Moses' prayers. But the faith of most had fled, and they ended up adding an extra 40 years to their trip. Numbers, which records the tragic story of Israel's unbelief, should serve as a dramatic lesson for all of God's people. God loves us and wants the very best for us. He can and should be trusted. Numbers also gives a clear portrayal of God's patience. Again and again, he withholds the justice they deserve and preserves the nation. But his patience must not be taken for granted. His judgment will come, and we must obey. As part of their preparations, the Lord gave strict guidelines to the Israelites regarding purity in the camp. He wanted them to have a lifestyle distinct from the nations around them. He wanted them to be a holy people. Likewise, we should concern ourselves with purity in the church. On the first approach to the Promised Land, when they arrived at the town of Kadesh, spies were sent into Canaan to assess its strength. 10 returned with fearful stories of giants. Only Caleb and Joshua encouraged them to go up and take possession of the land as God intended. Chapter 13, verse 28 through chapter 14, verse 10. The Israelites chose to listen to the 10 and were prevented from entering because of their unbelief. Because of their unbelief, God declared that their present generation would not live to see the promised land. God says in chapter 14, verses 22 to 24, quote, "Not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it," unquote. This shows how severely God can punish sin. Instead, Caleb and his descendants would later inherit the land. So, thus, the 40-year wanderings began. During these desert wanderings, there was a continuous pattern of grumbling, defiance, discipline, and death. How much better it would have been to have trusted God and entered his land. Then the terrible waitings began, waiting for the old generation to die off and waiting to see if the new generation could faithfully obey God. Throughout history, God's people have continued to struggle with lack of faith. We must prevent unbelief from gaining a foothold in our lives, for it will keep us from enjoying the blessings that God has promised. After the old generation had died, those who held on to Egypt's customs and values, a new generation trained in the ways of God stood poised and entered the promised land. As they were conquering nations and accumulating land, unfortunately, they were enticed by some of those nations to begin worshiping other gods. The Moabites, who lived east of the Jordan River across from Jericho, and the Midianites, who lived across from Mount Sinai near the Red Sea, summoned and offered to pay Balaam, who was a famous sorcerer, to curse Israel, but he would not do it. But he did accept money to give them advice on how to draw the Israelites to idol worship. Balaam knew what was right, but he gave in to the temptation of material rewards from Midian and Moab and sinned. Although Balaam realized the awesome power of Israel's God, his heart was occupied with the wealth he could gain in Moab. He was a man ready to obey God's command only if he could profit from doing so. Knowing what is right alone is never enough. We must also do what is right. The book of Numbers ends as it begins, with preparation. This new generation of Israelites were numbered and sanctified. After defeating numerous armies, they settled on the east side of the Jordan River. Then they faced their greatest test, to cross the river and possess all the beautiful land God promised them. The lesson is clear. God's people must trust him, moving ahead by faith, if we are to claim his promised land. Although God's punishment for sin is often severe, he offers reconciliation and hope. His love is truly amazing. Just as God's love and law led Israel to the promised land, God desires to give purpose and destiny to our lives. God is willing to accept us, forgive us, and literally make us over from within. Thank you.